Maid's daughter watched everyone ignore CEO's deaf son until she spoke to him in sign language. "You don't need to talk to him. He won't understand you." The words, spoken with careless indifference by a passing guest, sliced into Clara's heart. From her hiding spot behind the velvet curtains, the 11-year-old Maid's daughter watched the glittering ballroom of Grayson Manor spin with laughter, music, and crystal light. But her gaze wasn't on the champagne glasses or jeweled gowns. It was fixed on the boy standing alone in the far corner, Leo Grayson, son of Richard Grayson, one of the most powerful CEOs in the world. His father glided through the crowd, praised, toasted, admired, and yet Leo, his only child, stood forgotten. His lips moved faintly as he tried to read the chatter around him, but no one spoke to him. They spoke at him. They spoke about him, and every time their words slid past like arrows through fog. Leo was deaf. The car accident that had stolen his mother years ago had also taken his hearing. Since then, the boy had become an ornament at his father's galas, dressed sharply, positioned politely, ignored completely. His silence made the wealthy guests uncomfortable. His father's refusal to acknowledge that silence made it worse. Clara's fists clenched. She remembered her great-grandfather Henry, the war veteran who had taught her that courage means seeing the forgotten. He had taught her sign language, the secret language he once used with a comrade who couldn't hear explosions but could still read loyalty in a friend's hands. Now, as Clara watched Leo's eyes glaze over with loneliness, Henry's words pulsed in her chest. Never let anyone be left behind. She stepped out from behind the curtain. Her heart pounded as she crossed the marble floor, ignoring the whispers, ignoring her mother's warning not to disturb the masters. She raised her hands and formed a single, careful sign. Hello. Leo's eyes widened. For the first time that night, his face broke open into a real smile. And in that single spark, brighter than all the chandeliers above, the empire of Richard Grayson began to shift. What would happen when the richest man in the room realized that the only person who could reach his son was the maid's daughter? Grayson Manor was a world of excess. Nestled on sprawling acres of manicured gardens, fountains, and marble terraces, it stood as a testament to Richard Grayson's empire. Every chandelier dripped with crystal, every hallway lined with oil paintings, every glass of wine imported from a private vineyard in France. On gala nights, the mansion gleamed like a jewel, an artificial sun drawing the wealthiest moths to its flame. Richard Grayson, CEO of a global tech conglomerate, moved through this world like a king. He was tall, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed in tailored suits that whispered power with every stitch. His steel gray eyes betrayed exhaustion, but his presence commanded attention. Shareholders admired him. Politicians courted him. Guests laughed at his every remark. Yet beneath the surface, his aura carried something colder, loneliness carefully concealed by wealth. Richard's life was a paradox. He had conquered industries, but not grief. Years ago, a car accident had taken his wife Eleanor, a woman of warmth and music, and left his son Leo with silence that no medical intervention could undo. Richard never recovered. Instead of embracing his son's world, he tried to bury Eleanor's memory and force Leo to live in his own, a world of sound, speeches, deals, applause. But Leo could not follow him there, and so the boy drifted through the mansion like a ghost at his own father's banquets. At 11, Leo stood apart from the noise, dressed sharply in miniature tuxedos, but always on the margins. Guests whispered about him with pity or discomfort. Some called him the tragedy. Others simply avoided him. Richard rarely introduced him, rarely looked directly at him. He loved his son, but he didn't know how to bridge the silence. Clara saw what others missed. As the daughter of the manor's head housekeeper, she had grown up in the shadows of this world of excess. While the chandeliers glittered above, she swept in corners, polished glassware, and stayed invisible by her mother's strict instruction. But Clara had a different inheritance, one not of wealth, but of courage. Her great-grandfather Henry, a decorated war veteran, had taught her 3 things. 1. Courage is doing what's right when no one else will. 2. No one deserves to be left behind. 3. Communication is more than words. He had learned sign language during the war to speak with a fellow soldier who couldn't hear the bombardments but could still fight with loyalty and heart. When Clara was little, Henry had passed this skill to her, showing her how hands could speak when voices failed. To Clara, it was like learning the secret code of compassion. At the gala, Clara lingered near the velvet curtains unseen. She clutched the worn poetry book Henry had left her, his notes scribbled in the margins about courage and friendship. She wasn't part of the world of jeweled gowns and polished laughter, but she was part of the world of watchfulness. And in her quiet observation, she noticed Leo. He stood alone near the corner, his posture straight but stiff, his eyes darting to lips he couldn't fully read. He smiled politely when people brushed past, but his eyes were dull, carrying the heavy mask of practiced detachment. Clara recognized that mask. It was the same one her mother wore after long days of bowing to wealthy employers. The mask of survival. The hierarchy was brutal. Richard ruled the gala, adored by his guests. The wealthy flocked to him, craving his approval. Staff moved silently, invisible, and Leo, supposed heir to all of it, was stranded between worlds, too visible to be ignored, too misunderstood to belong. Clara's heart ached. She remembered Henry's words. The bravest thing you can do is see someone when the whole world looks away. Richard, in the center of the ballroom, raised his glass for a toast. Guests applauded. Cameras flashed. The CEO looked every bit the titan of industry, a man who had it all. Yet just behind him, his son remained forgotten, silent in the shadow of chandeliers. Clara knew then that the story of this house wasn't Richard's success. It was Leo's isolation, and perhaps her own role in changing it. With her small hands clutching Henry's poetry book, Clara made her decision. She would not let the boy remain unseen. She would use the language of her hands to give him a voice, even if the cost was her mother's anger or the risk of being dismissed. Because courage, Henry always said, isn't loud. Sometimes it's just stepping forward when no one else will. And so, under the glittering cruelty of Grayson Manor, a maid's daughter took her first step toward changing the life of a billionaire's forgotten son. The string quartet played a cheerful waltz as glittering gowns swirled across the ballroom. Waiters balanced trays of champagne, and laughter rang like bells in the vaulted ceiling. To most, it was a perfect evening. To Leo Grayson, it was another night of exile. He stood in his corner, eyes scanning lips that moved too quickly, too carelessly, for him to follow. Every now and then, someone's gaze would brush over him. A polite smile, a nod, nothing more. When a guest did approach, It was only to pat his shoulder or offer a meaningless word, always through his father, never to him. Clara had seen enough. She tightened her grip on Henry's poetry book, stepped out from behind the curtain, and crossed the marble floor. Her small shoes clicked faintly, almost drowned in the music, but to her it felt like a drumbeat. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, "Don't ever disturb the masters. Keep your head down, Clara." But Henry's words were louder. No one should be left behind. She reached Leo. He looked up, startled by her sudden presence. His eyes were wary, guarded. Clara hesitated only a moment, then lifted her hand and signed, "Hello?" For a breath, nothing. Then, like clouds parting after storm, Leo's face transformed. His lips curved into a real smile, bright, unrestrained, the kind that no mask could hide. He signed back swiftly, "You know this?" Clara nodded, her hands fumbling but certain. "A little. My great-grandfather taught me." Leo's eyes lit up. In that instant, the invisible wall around him cracked. He began signing quickly, telling her he disliked the gala, that the people reminded him of peacocks strutting their feathers. Clara laughed softly, and he joined her, shoulders shaking with mirth. For the first time that evening, Leo wasn't silent. He was alive. But their joy did not go unnoticed. A pair of socialites glanced over, their jeweled earrings swaying as they leaned close to whisper. "Is that the maid's daughter?" one said, lips curling, "talking to the boy as if they're equals?" Another guest chuckled. "How quaint! The poor girl probably thinks she's helping. He can't even hear her." Clara felt the weight of their stares. Heat rose in her cheeks, but Leo's smile gave her courage. She ignored them, raising her hands again. "Do you like the stars?" Leo's face glowed. He signed eagerly about constellations, about how the universe was quiet like him, about how his mother used to trace patterns in the night sky with him before the accident. His hands moved like poetry, painting worlds Clara had never seen, and yet, across the ballroom, Richard Grayson remained oblivious. He stood in the center of attention, glass raised, basking in applause. His voice carried over the music, announcing donations, joking with politicians, thanking investors. He never once turned to see his son smile. Clara's heart tightened. This was the betrayal, not from strangers' whispers, but from a father who refused to look, who denied his son silence by drowning it in noise. A few minutes later, a tall assistant approached briskly. "Leo, your father needs you for photographs." The man didn't bend to meet Leo's gaze. He simply gestured impatiently toward the cameras. Leo's smile vanished. His shoulders slumped. The mask slid back into place. He gave Clara one last quick sign, "Friend," before following the assistant. Clara watched him go, fury and sorrow tangling in her chest. Around her, the guests resumed their chatter, dismissing what they had seen. To them, it had been nothing. A servant's child amusing a lonely boy. To Clara, it was everything, proof that Leo didn't need pity. He needed to be seen. And yet the cruel truth lingered. In a mansion of brilliance, Leo remained invisible. Clara had reached him, yes, but the world around them had mocked, and his own father hadn't noticed at all. That night, as she retreated to the servants' quarters, Clara whispered to Henry's poetry book, "I won't let them ignore him forever. Someone has to listen." Her vow burned quietly, a small spark against the cold empire of Richard Grayson. The conflict had begun. Clara lay awake that night in the servants' wing, the echoes of the gala still buzzing in her ears. The image of Leo's smile, The first real one she had ever seen on his face, glowed in her memory like a lantern. She opened her great-grandfather Henry's poetry book, its pages yellowed and margins filled with his cramped handwriting. On the inside cover was a note Henry had once written to her mother. Teach her to see those no one else sees. Henry had been more than just a veteran. He was Clara's compass, the man who filled her earliest years with lessons disguised as games. She remembered sitting on his porch as cicadas hummed in the summer air. He would tap her shoulder, point at a bird, then sign its name with gnarled hands. Bird, sky, fly. Clara would copy clumsily, her small fingers twisting. Henry would smile patiently, correcting her gently until her hands shaped the signs correctly. "Why do we need this?" she once asked, giggling at the strange movements. Henry's eyes softened, clouded with memory. "Because when I was a soldier, I had a brother in arms who couldn't hear the bombs. They thought he was broken, but he wasn't. He just needed a different way to speak. And he spoke to me, saved my life once." From then on, Clara never saw sign language as strange. She saw it as a bridge for those the world ignored. Henry had passed away when Clara was only 7, but his lessons lived inside her like seeds. Seeds that began to bloom when she saw Leo standing alone at every party. But Leo's silence had its own story. Years before Clara ever stepped into Grayson Manor, Leo's life had been full of sound. His mother, Eleanor, was the music of the house, literally. She filled the grand halls with piano, laughter, and gentle guidance. She taught Leo to love the stars, to trace constellations on clear nights, to listen not just with ears, but with heart. Then came the night that shattered everything. A rain-slicked highway, a car that spun too fast. Eleanor was gone in an instant. Leo survived, but the crash stole his hearing forever. Richard Grayson's grief was volcanic. He buried every trace of Eleanor. Her piano was closed, her photographs taken down, her music silenced. In his pain, he chose denial. He poured himself into work, into the empire he could control, while refusing to enter the silent world Leo now inhabited. "Lip reading is enough," Richard told tutors. "No need for hand signs or pity." So Leo learned to wear the mask. He learned to smile politely, to nod, to fade into corners. He was dressed in suits, paraded at events, but never spoken to in his own language. His world shrank, not because of his deafness, but because no one would meet him where he was. That was the betrayal. Clara glimpsed pieces of this truth over the years. A photograph of Eleanor hidden in the library, its frame tucked behind books. A faint layer of dust on the grand piano. Keys never touched. Servants whispering of the night. Richard locked himself in his study and ordered Eleanor's belongings removed. Her mother had warned her never to pity the Graysons. "They are powerful," she said. "Their sorrow is not ours to mend." But Clara couldn't help it. Every time she passed Leo in the corridors, every time she saw him standing mute beside his father, she felt Henry's words stir in her chest. No one left behind. It was that inheritance that guided her steps at the gala. It was that inheritance that shaped her hands into the sign for hello. And in Leo's sudden joy, she had seen something else, something Richard refused to see. The boy wasn't broken. He was brilliant. He loved the stars. He carried his mother's spark in his silence. But without someone to listen, that spark would fade. Clara traced her finger over Henry's margin note again. "Teach her to see those no one else sees," she whispered into the darkness. I saw him, Grandpa. I saw him." In another wing of the mansion, Richard Grayson sat alone in his study, glass of whiskey untouched on the desk. The echoes of the gala had faded, but a flash of something unsettled him. His son, smiling. He had caught it in the corner of his eye before the assistant whisked Leo away. It was not a polite smile. It was real, and it had not been for him. Richard clenched the glass until his knuckles whitened. The empire he ruled could silence competitors, bend politicians, and dazzle investors, but it could not reach his son, and though he would not admit it, not yet, he knew he had been replaced in that single smile by a maid's daughter. The summer afternoon was bright, the garden of Grayson Manor alive with the buzz of cicadas and the scent of roses. Clara and Leo sat under the drooping willow, their secret haven. Leo had been trying to reach a kite stuck high on the stone wall. He climbed too quickly, hands stretching upward. Clara shouted, but he couldn't hear. His foot slipped. Leo tumbled down, landing hard on the grass with a cry of pain. Clara raced to him, her heart pounding. "Leo!" she shouted, kneeling beside him. His ankle twisted awkwardly, his face pale with shock. Within minutes, Richard Grayson arrived, summoned by frantic staff. He strode across the lawn, his suit jacket unbuttoned, his tie loose, eyes sharp with fear. "Leo!" he barked, kneeling beside his son. "Where does it hurt? Speak to me." Leo's hands flew desperately, signing rapid words, his eyes pleading. Clara saw every gesture clearly. "Not bad, just my ankle." "Am I in trouble?" But Richard didn't see. He stared at his son's moving hands with blank incomprehension. His jaw tightened. "Stop waving, Leo. Just tell me what's wrong." Clara's chest burned. She couldn't stay silent. She stepped forward, voice ringing louder than she thought possible. "Mr. Grayson, he's talking to you." Richard whipped his head toward her, startled. "What did you say?" "He's signing," Clara said fiercely, tears brimming in her eyes. "Your son is telling you it's not serious. He's scared you'll be angry." The words hung heavy in the air. For the first time, Richard faltered. His shoulders sagged, his face caught between pride and shame. Slowly, he turned back to Leo. "Is that what you said?" he asked, his voice unsteady. Leo nodded, his eyes wide, still signing with trembling hands. "Not serious. Don't be mad." Richard looked lost, crushed by a truth he had ignored for too long. He reached for his son, gathering him into his arms, but the hug was clumsy, his fear tangled with guilt. Clara wiped her cheeks. "You don't see him," she whispered. "He's been talking to you all along, but you never looked." The accusation struck harder than any boardroom rival's words could have. Richard Grayson, the man who bent nations with contracts, stood speechless before a maid's daughter. That evening, he summoned Clara to his study. The shelves of leather-bound books and the scent of oak polish loomed around her. Richard poured a glass of water and set it before her as if she were not staff, but a guest. You're his friend," he said slowly. "How long have you known sign language?" "My great-grandfather taught me," Clara answered. "He said no one should be left behind." Richard's gaze softened, though it carried decades of regret. "Teach me," he said. His voice was low, almost pleading. "Teach me how to speak to my son." Clara's heart raced. "I'll teach you, but not for money, for Leo, because he's my friend." For the first time in years, Richard Grayson truly looked at someone, not as staff, not as an investor, but as a child who had done what he could not. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the beginning of a bridge. At first, Richard's promise seemed fragile, like glass that might shatter with the slightest doubt. But Clara took him at his word. The next morning, she met him in the sunlit dining hall with Leo by her side, and for the first time in years, the richest man in the room sat down not as a CEO but as a student. Clara raised her hands. "This," she said, signing slowly, "means father." Richard's broad hands mimicked hers awkwardly, stiff at the joints. His face flushed as he stumbled through the movements. Leo watched from across the table, skeptical, his eyes narrowed. For so long, his father's gaze had been empty when Leo signed. Now, seeing Richard struggle to shape the words with his hands, Leo folded his arms, unwilling to believe it. But Richard kept trying, again and again. Each failed motion chipped away at the stone wall he had built around his grief. Clara corrected him gently, never mocking, always encouraging. By the end of that morning, Richard managed one halting phrase directed straight at his son. "Hello, Leo." The boy froze. His lips parted, his hands trembling. Slowly, uncertainly, Leo signed back. "Hello, Father." The air in the room shifted. From then on, lessons became daily rituals. Richard carved out time between board meetings and shareholder calls to sit with Clara and Leo. He practiced clumsily, sometimes laughing at himself, sometimes swearing under his breath when his fingers refused to cooperate. But he never quit. Soon, word spread through the household. At Richard's command, the staff gathered in the great dining hall. Maids, gardeners, drivers, all stood uncertain as Clara took her place at the front. Richard stood beside her, his suit jacket off, sleeves rolled up. "From today forward," he announced, his voice steady, "this house will learn a new language, the language of my son, the language of our family." And with that, the revolution began. It was awkward at first. The cook signed "thank you" with the wrong hand. The chauffeur mixed up hungry and angry. The gardeners stumbled over "good morning." Yet laughter filled the halls, real warm laughter that had been absent since Eleanor's death. Richard was the most determined student of all. He carried flashcards into meetings, tracing signs under the table while billion-dollar deals unfolded around him. He corrected executives who chuckled at his hobby, silencing them with a glare sharper than any boardroom argument. The results at home were undeniable. For the first time, Leo and his father had conversations that weren't filtered through tutors or awkward lip-reading. Richard asked about the stars his son loved, and Leo, hands flying with excitement, showed him sketches of galaxies he had drawn. Richard signed back clumsily but sincerely, "Beautiful, you are an artist." Tears stung Leo's eyes. No one had ever called him that before. One evening, Clara found Richard alone in the attic. The dust-covered piano stood silent, its keys untouched since Eleanor's death. Richard sat before it, his large hands hovering uncertainly. Then he pressed down, the notes rough but recognizable. Clara watched quietly as he played the melody Eleanor once loved, halting and broken, yet filled with longing. Leo appeared at the doorway, drawn by the vibrations he could feel in the floorboards. Richard looked up, meeting his son's gaze. He lifted his hands and signed. "This was your mother's song. She is still here." For the first time, Leo stepped forward and placed his hand on the piano, feeling the music ripple through his bones. Father and son shared a silence that was not empty, but sacred. The transformation spread beyond the manor. At Richard's urging, Leo's tutors all became fluent in sign language. Board members, reluctantly at first, learned to sign greetings when visiting the estate. The press caught wind of the change, splashing headlines about the silent revolution of Grayson Manor. Some mocked it as sentimental, others praised it as visionary. But for Richard, it was not about image. It was about redemption. At a shareholder gala months later, Richard did something no one expected. Instead of giving a speech with his polished baritone, he stood beside Leo in front of hundreds of flashing cameras. He raised his hands and signed his entire address, while Clara voiced the words aloud for the crowd. "I built an empire of sound, but I forgot how to listen. My son has taught me a language that cannot be bought or sold, a language of hands, of silence, of heart. Tonight, I invite you to see not just my company, but my family." The hall fell into stunned silence before erupting into applause. For once, the praise did not feel hollow. It felt earned. Leo stood taller that night, not as a shadow, not as a pity, but as a boy whose father finally heard him, and beside him stood Clara, the bridge who had made it possible. The man once called untouchable had revealed his truest power, not wealth, not influence, but the humility to learn, the courage to change, and the love to listen. The city gala was meant to be another triumph for Richard Grayson. Investors filled the marble hall, chandeliers sparkled, and photographers circled like hawks. Leo and Clara stood quietly at his side, a united front that had become the new face of the Grayson household. But not everyone welcomed the change. Two women, draped in diamonds, whispered loudly enough for half the room to hear. "What a tragedy," one sighed, her eyes darting toward Leo. "So much money, yet such a broken heir." The other smirked, nodding toward Clara. "And look at her, playing nursemaid. A maid's daughter masquerading as family. Imagine the scandal." Their laughter rang sharp, like glass shattering. Leo stiffened. His hands twitched, wanting to sign a retort, but years of being silenced held him back. Clara's cheeks burned, fury flashing in her eyes. She stepped forward, ready to defend him. But Richard moved faster. He crossed the floor in 3 strides, his presence towering over the women. The room hushed. Every camera turned. He raised his hands. Slowly, deliberately, he signed for all to see, his voice following in Clara's translation. "My son is not a tragedy. He is an artist, a dreamer, the best part of me." Gasps rippled through the hall. Richard's gaze sharpened. He turned slightly, gesturing to Clara. "And this young woman is not a servant pretending. She is family. She gave me back my son." His tone cut through the silence like steel. "If you cannot respect them, then you do not belong in my house or in my company." The women faltered, their painted smiles crumbling. One tried to stammer an apology, but the damage was done. The crowd shifted, abandoning them like vultures leaving carrion. Leo's chest rose, pride swelling where shame had once lived. Clara stood straighter, no longer hidden, but acknowledged before the world. The reversal was complete. The arrogant had fallen, not through cruelty, but through Richard's grace and undeniable truth. He did not humiliate them further. He did not gloat. He simply turned, laid a steady hand on Leo's shoulder, and guided Clara back to his side. The cameras flashed wildly, capturing not just a titan of industry, but a father who had finally chosen love over image. And for once, Richard Grayson's empire was not applauding his wealth. It was applauding his humanity. The celebration wound down hours later, but the weight of Richard's words still hung in the air. The photographs splashed across the news would show him as a man transformed, not by power, not by wealth, but by love. Yet the true ending of the night didn't happen in the ballroom. It happened beneath the open sky. Richard led Leo and Clara out to the gardens, away from the lights and cameras. The willow tree where Clara and Leo had first shared their secrets bent gently in the evening breeze. Above them, the stars stretched wide and silent. Leo tilted his head back, eyes glowing. He lifted his hands and signed, "The stars don't make noise, but they still shine." Richard swallowed hard, his throat thick. Slowly, carefully, he signed back, "Like you." Leo froze, then his lips curved into a smile brighter than the constellations overhead. Clara laughed softly, her own hands moving in quick signs. "Both of you." Finally seeing each other, they sat together on the grass, Richard still in his loosened suit, Clara in her plain dress, Leo between them. For once, titles and hierarchies melted away. There was no CEO, no maid's daughter, no forgotten heir. There were only three people bound by something stronger than wealth: the courage to listen. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, framed photograph. It was Eleanor, radiant at the piano. He handed it to Leo, his hands trembling. "I should have never hidden her from you," he said, his voice low. "She's as much a part of you as she was of me." Leo touched the frame reverently, then signed, "She's here, in the music, in us." Richard closed his eyes, letting the truth settle deep. For years, he had tried to bury grief under empire. Tonight, he let it breathe, and it did not destroy him. It healed him. Clara leaned back against the willow, Henry's poetry book in her lap. She traced the faded margin note once more. "Teach her to see those no one else sees." She smiled. She had kept that promise. The stars above shimmered in silence. Richard wrapped an arm around Leo, Clara resting on the other side. For the first time, the Grayson estate was not an empire of noise, but a home of listening hearts. And in that hush before dawn, the smallest voice had changed the largest life.